History loves to paint ancient warfare as noble, strategic, and heroic. But when you look closely, it's a mess. Commanders sent men into battle wearing bright colors. Armies shouted their location with drums and flutes. Sieges were launched over superstitions. And soldiers died on hills that no one wanted the next day. In this journey through the absurd, you'll discover 50 real battlefield decisions that defy logic and somehow still shape the world. Not everything in history makes sense. And war, most of all, never did. Let's begin. It sounds like something out of a dark comedy. Let's strap fire to a living creature and see what happens. But for several ancient civilizations, that idea wasn't a punchline. It was a military tactic. Start with the ancient Greeks, who are credited with one of the earliest versions of this flaming animal absurdity. During sieges, they would douse birds, often pigeons or sparrows, in pitch, light them on fire, and release them to fly home. The hope was simple, that these blazing birds would return to the wooden rooftops of enemy cities, setting them ablaze from within. A risky plan. Yes. A grotesque one. Definitely. A reliable one. Absolutely not. Because pigeons, like all creatures, panic when set on fire. They don't always fly straight. They don't always go home. Often they veer off wildly, crash into nearby structures, or even turn back toward the attacking army, setting friendly tents, siege towers, or supply carts aflame. If that happened, the attacker became the victim of their own flailing firestorm. And this wasn't the only case. In ancient Rome, records describe the use of war pigs against enemy war elephants. Elephants, mighty as they were, had one tragic weakness: they were terrified of squealing pigs. So Romans covered pigs in tar, set them alight, and sent them squealing into the enemy's elephant lines. In some cases it worked. The elephants panicked, trampled their own men, and fled. But more often it created chaos on both sides. No military manual today recommends tossing flaming pigs into battle for good reason. They're hard to control, brutally inhumane, and dangerously unpredictable. One wrong turn, and the battlefield turns into an accidental inferno. Worse still, ancient armies often fought near wooden fortifications, dense supply carts, or flammable siege engines. One stray spark could undo an entire campaign. Why did they try it then? Because fear is powerful. And desperation makes men creative. Using animals in warfare was already common: horses, dogs, even elephants. So some commanders simply took that logic one step too far. If a dog can carry a message, why not a torch? If a pig can squeal, why not squeal while on fire? But tactics like these show how thin the line is between military innovation and self-inflicted disaster. Flaming animals weren't clever. They weren't precise. They were spectacle. Panic dressed as strategy, and in most cases, they made far more sense as myths than as plans. To the Romans it was madness, to the Celts it was tradition, but to any modern military strategist it was simply suicide. Charging into battle without armor was not a rare accident of unpreparedness, it was an intentional and deeply symbolic act by many ancient Celtic warriors. Naked, painted and woad, their bodies glistening with sweat and defiance, they ran headfirst into spear lines, shields and arrows with nothing but a weapon and a war cry. It wasn't a one-off. Multiple ancient sources, including the Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, confirm this practice. Entire divisions of Celtic tribes, particularly the Geatidae from the Alps, were known to strip down and fight nude against the might of the Roman legions. Why? The reasons were layered in ritual, belief, and intimidation. First, there was the spiritual idea that going into battle bare was an offering to the gods, an act of bravery that defied mortality. Stripped of earthly protection, the warrior placed his fate entirely in the hands of the divine. Second, there was the psychological tactic. Picture a line of howling, muscular men, their bodies covered in blue paint and blood, sprinting toward you unarmored, unconcerned, and utterly unashamed. For the uninitiated, it was terrifying. These were not men with a rational fear of death. They looked like spirits of violence unleashed from the earth itself. And third, some believed it helped mobility. Without armor they could move faster, more fluidly and with fewer encumbrances, but that logic collapsed the moment they met disciplined soldiers with javelins and chainmail. The result? Slaughter. Roman armies, professional, tactical, and shielded, rarely lost to these naked charges. While the Celts may have hoped their fearlessness would disrupt formations, it often backfired. The Romans held steady, the Celts fell in droves. And yet the tradition persisted in various forms, because to the Celtic mind, honor mattered more than efficiency. Dying with courage was better than surviving with shame. Even if the tactic made no military sense, it made mythic sense. It forged legends, it inspired songs, it defined what it meant to be a warrior. But on a battlefield, especially one with archers, honor isn't armor. And sometimes, the bravest men are the first to bleed. They were called the Immortals. A name whispered by both friend and foe, a symbol of an empire that stretched from the rivers of Mesopotamia to the edges of India. A 10,000-strong elite force within the Achaemenid Persian army, said to remain constant in number. Every time one soldier fell, another stepped seamlessly into his place, preserving the illusion of an unbroken eternal legion. But behind the myth, the reality was far stranger, and far less practical. The Immortals were a ceremonial and elite corps, yes, but their armor was not designed for endurance. Their reputation was built less on tactical innovation and more on spectacle. These were not soldiers encased in steel. They wore fine robes, carried wickerwork shields, and bore ornate spears and short swords. Their uniforms were designed for uniformity, elegance, and symbolic terror. But the moment they met heavily armored opponents, like the Greek hoplites or Scythian cavalry, the illusion began to crumble. Take the Battle of Thermopylae. There Persian forces, including the Immortals, faced off against a small band of Greek warriors, mostly Spartans who were heavily shielded, bronze-plated and trained to fight in tight interlocking formations. The Immortals, for all their grace, were no match for the solid wall of bronze and discipline. Their wicker shields splintered. Their shorter spears failed to penetrate Greek defenses. They were cut down not by superior numbers or strategy, but by their own equipment's limitations. The Persians had armor. Scale mail was not unknown to them, but the Immortals' aesthetic was prioritized. It mattered more that they looked unified, imposing, godlike, than that they survived. It wasn't always a disaster. Against less organized armies or in open terrain with ranged support, the Immortals could act as flexible shock troops. Their bows used at distance were deadly. Their movements were coordinated and visually striking. And for ceremonial presence, such as escorting kings or demonstrating Persian might, they were unmatched. But on the battlefield where steel met sinew and strategy met terrain, the Immortals often found themselves outmatched. Their mystique endured because Persian chroniclers elevated them to legend. The Greeks too gave them a mythic status, not out of admiration but to make their own victories seem grander. We defeated the Immortals, they would say, as if they had slain ghosts. In truth, the Immortals were elite in name but not always in utility. They were dressed more for drama than durability. Their shields stopped arrows but not spearheads. Their swords glinted in the sun but bent against bronze, and their matching uniforms, perfect for a parade, not so much for a clash with Macedonian cavalry. Why did the Persians keep them? Because empire is not just about winning battles, it's about performing control. And the Immortals, in their perfection, were propaganda in motion. They projected an idea of divine continuity, of a ruler whose reach never faltered, whose troops never died, whose power was immortal. But no soldier is immortal, and no armor made of symbolism can stop a blade. In the end, the Immortals were not undone by their enemies but by their own myth, one that favored appearance over adaptation. There is something undeniably cinematic about ancient war chariots. The thunder of hooves, the screech of wheels, warriors racing across the plains, loosing arrows or swinging blades as they tear through enemy lines. They are icons of ancient warfare, from Egyptian murals to Chinese scrolls to the pages of Homer's Iliad. But there's one major problem with the chariot. The ground has to be perfect. Flat, dry, obstacle-free. And how many battlefields in the ancient world offered that? Chariots began as brilliant inventions in regions like Mesopotamia and Anatolia, where the terrain was ideal: wide plains, open routes, minimal obstruction. There they were revolutionary. A chariot could turn an archer into a mobile artillery unit, or a nobleman into a fast-moving commander. For a while they changed everything. But as empires expanded and war spilled into more difficult terrains, rocky valleys, marshy hillsides, dense forests, the limits of the chariot became painfully obvious. One famous disaster, the Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BCE. The Persian king Darius III fielded scythed war chariots against Alexander the Great's forces. These were no ordinary chariots. They had spinning blades attached to their wheels, designed to slice through enemy formations. It looked terrifying on paper. In reality, the Macedonians calmly adjusted. They opened their lines. They let the chariots pass harmlessly through, then turned and cut them down from behind. The terrain was not smooth. The formations were not predictable. The chariots, instead of breaking the Greek lines, became spectacular liabilities. It wasn't just the Macedonians. Across Asia, China's warring states period saw the same shift. As warfare evolved toward cavalry and infantry formations that emphasized maneuverability and terrain use, the chariot became more of a throne than a weapon. It made sense for kings to ride in chariots as symbols of status, but to use them as core strategy, that became a tactical joke. The problem wasn't just about physical terrain, it was about logic. Chariots were expensive, hard to maintain, required specially trained horses, and often needed flat staging areas for deployment. Meanwhile, infantry could move through forests, up hills, across mud. Cavalry could adapt to speed, flank, and charge. Chariots got stuck, their wheels cracked, their horses panicked. Still, for centuries, kings clung to them. Because in war, not all decisions are about efficiency, they're about pride, about ceremony, about showing off, to allies, to enemies, to the gods. A chariot wasn't just a vehicle, it was a moving altar of command, a visual reminder that the man atop it ruled from above the dirt. But the dirt always wins. The chariot faded from use not with a single defeat, but with 1,000 small embarrassments, bogged down in fields, shattered on rocks, abandoned mid-battle, and like many ancient tactics, it lingered long past its expiration date. Because in the minds of kings, it made perfect sense. And in the mud of war it made none at all. There's no denying the majesty of a war elephant. Looming above the battlefield, tusks sharpened, armor glinting, and a tower of archers mounted high on its back. The image itself is enough to make armies hesitate. Elephants were ancient weapons of psychological warfare. They shattered cavalry charges, stomped infantry formations, and scattered enemy morale before a single arrow was fired. But what happens when the battlefield isn't so cooperative? What happens when those massive, unpredictable creatures are unleashed in narrow valleys, forest passes, or tight urban skirmishes? What happens is chaos. War elephants, as impressive as they looked, were notoriously difficult to control, and in the wrong environment, which was often, they became more dangerous to their own side than the enemy. Take the Battle of Zama 202 BCE, where Hannibal of Carthage deployed his famous war elephants against the Roman general Scipio Africanus. Hannibal was no fool. His elephants had worked in other battles, most notably during his legendary crossing of the Alps. But at Zama, the Romans had adapted. They left wide lanes in their formations, blew horns, and let the elephants pass harmlessly through. Some turned back in panic and trampled their own troops. Elephants are not precision weapons. They're frightened, intelligent, wild animals. When hurt, they go berserk. When scared, they stampede. And once a stampede starts, there's no distinction between friend and foe. Despite this, many commanders across India, Southeast Asia, and the Mediterranean continued to rely on them, long after their weaknesses were well known. Why? Because elephants weren't just soldiers, they were spectacle, a sign of wealth, dominance, divine favor. They turned the battlefield into theater. No one forgot the general who rode into war above the trees. It didn't matter if the elephant actually helped. Some rulers even believed the elephants were sacred, that their mere presence could shift destiny. But in reality, narrow ravines, marshy ground, tightly packed enemy lines, these were death traps. The elephant needed open space, controlled charge, and supportive infantry. In any other condition, they often panicked, turned, and created more disaster than glory. You can almost imagine the soldier looking up at a 12-foot mountain of muscle barreling the wrong way, realizing that the greatest threat to his life wasn't the enemy, it was his own army's ancient pride. Yes, naked. It wasn't just a myth or poetic exaggeration. Some ancient warriors, especially among the Celts and Gauls, went into battle unclothed, save perhaps for a belt, a torque, a metal neck ring, and a battle cry loud enough to curdle the blood of their enemies. To modern eyes it sounds like madness. Why remove the only thing that might keep you alive? Why expose yourself, quite literally, to swords, arrows, and the jeers of history? But to these warriors, the act was sacred, symbolic, and terrifying in its own right. There are historical accounts, notably by Roman authors like Livy and Polybius, describing bands of Celtic fighters charging without armor, without clothes, painted in woad, muscles tensed, screaming like banshees. The tactic served multiple purposes. Psychological warfare. A naked screaming man, armed and unafraid, is more unsettling than an armored one. The sheer audacity could shake enemy morale. Spiritual purity. Some groups believed that clothing corrupted the soul in battle. To meet death naked was to meet it honestly. Mobility. Armor was expensive and heavy. Moving without it offered speed and agility. Some warriors saw it as an edge. But let's be clear, it made no practical sense. One well-placed arrow, one spear from a distance, and a naked man falls just as fast, if not faster than one in mail. Worse still, Roman and Greek soldiers, disciplined and armored, rarely fell for the theatrics. They closed ranks, kept calm, and let the naked charge break itself against their shields. By the time Julius Caesar encountered such tribes during his Gallic campaigns, Roman tactics had long neutralized the chaos. Naked warriors, brave as they were, became easy targets, not because they lacked courage, but because they mistook it for invincibility. Still, for centuries the tradition persisted, because war in many ancient cultures wasn't just about winning, it was about dying well, about being seen by the gods, about the drama of it all. And there's no drama like a battlefield entrance where the first thing you drop isn't your sword, it's your trousers. In theory, the Roman testudo, or tortoise, formation is a tactical marvel. Shields lock tightly above and around a tight cluster of soldiers forming a near impenetrable shell. Arrows bounce off harmlessly. Spears can't find gaps. It is a walking fortress. Used correctly, it allowed Roman troops to advance under a hail of missiles, siege the walls of cities, or approach enemy positions with calculated protection. It was particularly effective in open terrain, with disciplined soldiers maintaining formation and focus. But when used improperly, and it often was, the testudo becomes less a fortress and more a coffin. Here says why. The formation's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, inflexibility. Inside the testudo, visibility is nearly zero. Peripheral awareness is gone, communication becomes muffled, and if even a few soldiers lose balance or fall, the entire structure begins to crumble. Now imagine using it not in a flat siege approach but on uneven ground, or in surprise ambushes. At the Battle of Carrhae 53 BCE, Roman commander Crassus led his legions into unfamiliar desert terrain against the Parthian cavalry. When the Parthians began showering the Romans with arrows from horseback, an ideal time theoretically to use the testudo, the Romans attempted to form it mid-march, but the sandy ground, heat, exhaustion, and chaos made it impossible to hold. Worse still, the formation provided no defense against the true Parthian weapon, mobility. Parthian horse archers circled the testudo, continuously firing from every angle, and heavy cavalry later slammed into its sides. The Romans had boxed themselves in. They had built their own trap. The testudo isn't a bad tactic, but like all tactics, it's situational. When commanders used it rigidly, believing it was a universal solution, it often turned disaster into certainty. And yet, across the empire it was taught, repeated, drilled, even when smarter adaptations were available. Why? Because Rome loved order, discipline, repetition. The testudo symbolized control in the face of chaos. It made for good sculpture, and sculpture made for good propaganda. You don't need nuance when you've got marble heroism. But history doesn't reward statues, it rewards strategy. And sometimes the smartest move isn't to close ranks, but to know when not to. This tactic sounds so absurd you might think it's apocryphal, but sadly it's all too real. In times of siege or retreat, various ancient armies from the Assyrians to medieval steppe raiders practiced a scorched earth strategy. If you can't win the land, make sure your enemy can't use it either. And one of the most disturbing versions of this tactic, poisoning your own wells. The idea was simple. If you were abandoning a town or village, you might dump corpses, dead animals or toxins into the local water supply. When your enemies arrived, thirsty and victorious, they would drink and suffer. Sounds clever? Only on paper. In practice, poisoning water sources was wildly unreliable and incredibly risky. For one, not all poisons work fast. Contaminated water may take days to sicken an enemy force, during which time they may have already moved on. Secondly, the environmental impact was long-term. If your army retreated but planned to retake the area later, they'd be left with toxic, unusable land. And worst of all, winds could shift, streams could flow, and the poison might affect your own flanks or local allies. Perhaps the most grotesque example occurred during the siege of Dura Europa's 3rd century CE. Though not exactly a case of poisoned wells, it involved the defenders deliberately releasing noxious smoke and gas into underground tunnels, sacrificing their own sappers to trap enemy diggers. It was chemical warfare, centuries too early. But even more widespread were rumors, never always confirmed, of commanders throwing carcasses into their own rivers, slaughtering animals, letting them rot, and watching as the stench crept into enemy camps. The problem: disease doesn't discriminate. The same flies that landed on the tainted water often found their way into friendly bread. Despite its madness, this tactic persisted in folklore and emergency warfare for centuries, because desperation breeds innovation, even terrible innovation. Why did it continue? Because in the ancient world, fear was a weapon, and the idea that your enemy might poison the very ground they stood on, that they would rather destroy their own home than let you drink from it, was enough to spook even hardened invaders. Of course, today we see the folly clearly. When your victory requires ruining the world you hope to rule, maybe the war isn't worth winning. To the ancient mind, bigger was always better, especially in siege warfare. From the Assyrians to the Greeks to the Romans, civilizations competed to build colossal wooden siege towers, sometimes over 100 feet tall, designed to breach walls, intimidate defenders, and serve as mobile fortresses. These towers were layered with archers, battering rams, boarding bridges and platforms, covered in wet hides to resist fire. They were marvels of early military engineering. But often they were also completely useless. Why? Because building a 10-story wooden tower in the middle of an active war zone is not as simple as a scroll sketch. Take the example of Demetrius I of Macedon, who in 305 BCE built what's still considered the largest siege tower ever constructed, the Heliopolis. It was a massive iron-plated 9-story death machine, moved by thousands of men. It bristled with catapults, ballistae and battering devices. It looked like something out of a modern fantasy film. It never breached the walls of roads. In fact, it got stuck in mud, repeatedly. The defenders cleverly diverted water to soften the soil beneath it. They also set traps, launched fire arrows, and used slings to kill the exposed movers. Eventually, Demetrius left it behind, this towering monument to engineering ambition, and fled. This wasn't an isolated incident. Siege towers often met tragic fates. They caught fire, broke under their own weight, or were rendered useless by changing terrain or hastily strengthened defenses. Why build them then? Partly to intimidate. A massive siege tower demoralized enemies. It screamed, "We have time, we have power, we stir coming." But also, and this is key, many ancient rulers were obsessed with theater. A giant siege tower wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. It showed ambition. It flattered the ego of the general. It made for better stories. The problem: you can set scale walls with stories. And when the wheels broke, when the supports cracked, and when archers simply picked off anyone inside, the tower went from symbol of power to monument of poor planning. It sets one thing to overthink a strategy. It's another to build a 100-foot coffin and push it slowly toward your enemy. Setting fire to your own ship sounds crazy. Sending that flaming ship straight at your enemy sounds brilliant. Unless you forget to check the wind. Fire ships, deliberately ignited vessels sent drifting toward enemy fleets, were used throughout ancient and medieval naval warfare. Greeks used them, Persians used them, Chinese commanders used them. The logic was simple: a burning ship is terrifying, and wooden warships packed with oil, rope, sails, and tar ignite like matchsticks. But this tactic had one massive flaw: it relied entirely on the wind. One shift in direction, one unlucky gust, and your fireship doesn't strike the enemy, it swings back toward your own fleet. That exact thing happened more than once. One of the most famous examples comes from the Battle of Red Cliffs 208 CE in China. Here, fireships were used masterfully by Zhou Yu to destroy the numerically superior fleet of Cao Cao. It worked only because the wind direction had been carefully observed and even manipulated using deception. But in less coordinated cases, particularly in Mediterranean warfare, commanders eager to show flair sent flaming ships forward without full understanding of local wind patterns, water currents, or enemy countermeasures. Sometimes the enemy would intercept them early, push them back with poles, or use grappling hooks to tow them aside. Other times, the flaming ships drifted aimlessly back into friendly docks. And once a fireship is burning, there's no unburning it. Some generals even forgot to remove the sails, meaning the ships would catch fire too quickly and collapse before even reaching the target. In more than one case, Allied soldiers were left trapped on docks, caught between their own fire fleet and an enemy fleet laughing in the distance. Why use such a risky tactic? Desperation, showmanship, or in some cases, sheer theatrical flair. Ancient battles weren't just about outcomes, they were performances, and a burning ship lighting up the night sky made for one hell of a performance, even if the curtain dropped on the wrong side. Because in war the wind listens to no one, and fire once freed has no allegiance. War elephants, towering trumpeting beasts clad in armor, tusks sharpened, eyes wild. In theory, they were ancient tanks, capable of trampling infantry, breaking lines, and terrifying horses. Used properly, as Hannibal did in the Second Punic War, they could wreak havoc on the battlefield. But used improperly, they became chaos incarnate. The problem with elephants isn't that they're weak, it's that they're unpredictable. They're animals, not machines. They panic, they run, they turn, and when thousands of men are packed tightly into formation, an out-of-control elephant isn't just a liability, it's a weapon turned backward. At the Battle of Zama 202 BCE, Hannibal's elephants were defeated, not by spears or fire, but by clever tactics. The Roman general Scipio opened gaps in his line, allowing the elephants to pass harmlessly through, while making noise and movement that terrified the animals. Several of them turned around and trampled Hannibal's own rear ranks. This wasn't unique to Hannibal. In many battles across India, Southeast Asia, and North Africa, elephants were deployed as a show of strength, even when handlers lacked experience. When the animals were injured, they rampaged. When surprised by loud noises or strange smells, they turned. Sometimes they simply refused to charge. And yet kingdoms kept using them. Why? Because of image. A king on an elephant was a symbol of divine authority. A charge of elephants struck fear in the hearts of less experienced armies. They could turn the tide, or create a stampede, and most importantly they were expensive. If you had elephants you showed you had wealth, reach and power. But power without control is a dangerous thing. One general in the Maurya Empire tried tying flaming torches to the tails of elephants to drive them forward, only to watch the panicked beasts torch his own camp. In medieval Sri Lanka, elephants were used as execution devices, until one trampled a prince's tent by accident. Elephants in war could be glorious, but they could also be nightmares, and the line between the two was thinner than a trunk's breadth. In the end, it was never about whether the elephant could win the war. It was about whether the humans could stop it from turning around. Imagine this: two great armies face each other across a dusty plain. The sun is high, the spears are ready, and morale is tense. But instead of clashing immediately, both sides pause. A lone warrior walks out from the front ranks, calls out a name, and challenges someone from the other army to single combat. What happens next could decide everything. This wasn't just a storybook invention. In many cultures, from the Greeks to the ancient Irish to the Indian epics, ritualized single combat was a very real and respected tradition. In Homer's Iliad, champions like Hector and Achilles meet in dramatic one-on-one duels. In ancient Ireland, the Tanbo Cualinge describes warriors halting entire battles to allow named champions to settle disputes. But here sits the problem. War is not a duel. By focusing on individual valor, armies often delayed their engagements, exposed their champions to unnecessary risk, and allowed enemy formations to rest and recalibrate. In some cases, these duels backfired. When a champion was killed too quickly or dishonorably, it could shatter morale. Some leaders became so obsessed with duel rituals that they refused to adapt to tactical needs. If the enemy refused the duel, insult, rage, often a rash charge followed, poorly planned and easily crushed. One real-world example comes from the Mahabharata, where the Pandavas and Kauravas engage in numerous duels governed by rigid rules, even while entire armies stood idle. Victory was sometimes delayed, sabotaged or turned into personal vendettas. Even during the Battle of Maldon in Anglo-Saxon England 991 CE, the English allowed Viking forces to cross a causeway before the fight, out of a sense of fairness and ritual honor. The result? A Viking victory and a lot of dead Anglo-Saxons. So why do it? Because honor mattered, reputation mattered. To win dishonorably was worse than to die nobly. Leaders were often judged not just by their victories, but by the style of those victories. A champion's name would echo in song, a sneaky ambush. Less so. In the modern mind it's ludicrous, but in the ancient psyche war was partly theater, partly myth. And when your culture believes that the gods are watching, how you fight matters more than who survives. You'd think blending into the environment would be a basic principle of battlefield survival. But many ancient armies did the opposite, dressing in bright reds, gleaming golds, intricate blues and polished metals that reflected the sun like mirrors. Roman centurions wore crimson. Persian immortals were draped in ornate silk. Greek hoplites often fought in polished bronze, with brightly colored shields and helmets adorned with plumes. Even Celtic warriors painted themselves in glowing blue woad, making themselves look more like mythical beings than soldiers. None of this offered any concealment. In fact, it made them easier targets, especially for archers. So why do it? Because in ancient warfare, visibility wasn't a liability, it was a weapon. Color and display served psychological, cultural, and practical roles. To stand out was to announce power. To wear the colors of your god, tribe, or emperor was to invoke divine support. It rallied your side and intimidated the enemy. Soldiers were meant to be seen, not hidden. And there's more, ancient armies rarely fought in stealth. Ambushes existed, but most battles began with clear lines and trumpet calls. Being seen, being recognized mattered. Officers needed to spot their troops. Soldiers needed to see their standards. In a world without radios or drones, bright banners and dazzling armor were tools of communication. The cost: exposure. Against archers, chariots, or skirmishers, bright uniforms made soldiers easier to pick off. Glinting metal under the sun drew attention. Dripping red cloaks might look fearsome, but they didn't stop arrows. And yet, cultures clung to it, even when they knew it was risky. The Spartans wore red so blood wouldn't show. Aztec warriors dressed in eagle feathers and jaguar pelts, transforming themselves into gods of war. Samurai wore ornate armor, sometimes with masks and horns, not to conceal but to terrify. In ancient warfare, looking like a hero mattered more than staying alive, because often the battlefield was as much a stage as a graveyard. Before the first arrow flew or sword clashed, many ancient armies paused, not for strategy but for the stars, the birds, the goat entrails. From the Babylonians to the Romans, from the Chinese dynasties to the tribes of Africa, battles were delayed, or cancelled, based on omens. If the flight of birds wasn't right, postpone the charge. If the priest saw a bad sign in the liver of a sacrificed animal, abandon the campaign. If a solar eclipse struck during war preparations, panic, desertion, or surrender could follow. One of the most famous examples comes from Plutarch's account of Crassus, the Roman general who invaded Parthia. Before the fateful Battle of Carrhae, 53 BCE, his troops reportedly encountered bad omens, lightning-struck weapons, sacred animals refused to eat, and one standard-bearer stumbled and dropped the eagle, a terrible sign. Crassus ignored the signs. He was annihilated, his army was decimated, his son killed, and his head used as a prop in a Parthian play. Ancient Chinese commanders relied on the I Ching or celestial alignments. Zoroastrians consulted priests to determine auspicious days for movement. Greek oracles were consulted for nearly every major campaign. Even Alexander the Great waited for favorable signs before some of his most critical maneuvers. Did this slow things down? Absolutely. Sometimes enemies attacked while rituals were still being performed. Other times, commanders postponed battle for days, giving enemies time to regroup or escape. Logic and tactical advantage were often sacrificed at the altar of superstition. Yet to the people of the time it wasn't foolish. It was wisdom. The gods were participants in every war. To disrespect the signs was to invite destruction. A victory without divine favor was hollow and dangerous. And even now, modern psychology shows how belief shapes action. Soldiers who thought the stars were aligned for them often fought with more courage. Those who feared the omens sometimes broke before the enemy arrived. In a world ruled by the unknown, rituals gave meaning, omens gave warning, superstition gave shape to chaos. And sometimes that was more important than a sword. One of the darkest and most disturbing tactics used in ancient warfare was the deployment of human shields, not volunteers, but slaves, prisoners of war, civilians, and even women and children pressed into the front lines or tethered to fortifications as living barriers. The logic, if it can be called that, was simple and brutal. Your enemy won't shoot if their own people are in the way. Ancient Assyrians were among the first to use this tactic in siege warfare, marching prisoners ahead of their army to absorb the first strikes or to dig trenches under fire. The idea was to protect valuable soldiers by forcing captives to take the risk. The psychological toll was immense, on both the captives and the attackers. In China's Warring States period, some generals reportedly lined up thousands of captured peasants in front of enemy fortifications, daring archers to strike their own kin. At times they went further, dressing prisoners in the uniforms of their own army to create confusion. But the most chilling account may come from the later campaigns of the Persian Empire, where entire towns of enslaved populations were marched in front of siege towers as living shields. The tactic was especially common when facing rebellious provinces, psychologically breaking the opponent by making them complicit in the deaths of their own. This wasn't merely cruelty, it was also propaganda. If an enemy chose to fire anyway, they could be branded as monsters. If they hesitated, they were weakened. Either way, the attacker maintained moral control of the battlefield. Still, it didn't always work. At the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans 70 CE, Jewish rebels were said to have fired upon their own captured comrades once they were strapped to Roman siege engines. The result? Mutual horror. A city that saw no way out, and a besieging force that learned fear could sometimes backfire. From a modern standpoint, the tactic is a war crime. From an ancient perspective, it was a grim calculus, lives for lives with morality left outside the gates. It wasn't that clever, it wasn't that noble. But it happened, more often than we care to admit. Picture a battlefield. Now imagine tens of thousands of soldiers arranged in perfect rows, block after block of rigid formation, gleaming shields, marching drums, and an air of unstoppable might. But then imagine what happens when the terrain isn't flat, or the enemy doesn't cooperate. Ancient commanders, especially in empires like Assyria, Egypt, and even Rome, loved large, tight, and uniform formations. From the Greek Phalanx to the Roman Testudo, the idea was unity, many soldiers moving as one, becoming more powerful than any single warrior could be. But this obsession with formation over flexibility often proved disastrous. One notable example is the Battle of Cannae, 216 BCE, where the Romans marched with a massive dense center, hoping to crush Hannibal's outnumbered Carthaginians with sheer force. Hannibal responded with a flexible crescent formation. As the Roman front pushed in, Hannibal's troops slowly retreated, curving inward. Then the wings snapped shut, and cavalry closed the rear. The Romans, trapped by their own formation, were slaughtered. In other battles, rigid formations struggled with terrain, marshes, hills, forests. These could break the lines, isolate units, and render carefully drilled patterns useless. Yet commanders kept insisting on these blocks. Why? Because in theory they looked invincible. Formations boosted morale. They allowed for discipline and command over large numbers. They created a psychological wall against chaos. But the second that wall cracked under arrows, ambush, or terrain, the collapse was swift and total. There was little room to adapt, units weren't trained to improvise, communication lagged, and soldiers drilled to obey in formation often hesitated to break ranks even when it meant survival. The Macedonian Sarissa Phalanx was a terrifying engine of death on flat ground, but useless in the woods. The Roman Testudo worked against missiles, but turned into a coffin if surrounded, and massive shield walls, while inspiring to see, could not pivot when attacked from the side. Ultimately, the strategy reflected the mindset, control over chaos, but the battlefield doesn't reward rigidity, it rewards adaptation. And ancient armies, for all their discipline, often collapsed not from weakness, but from inflexibility. At the strange intersection of religion and warfare lies one of the most baffling tactics ever employed: sacred animals used as protection. The clearest and most infamous example comes from the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE, when the Persian king Cambyses II faced the Egyptian army. Knowing the Egyptians revered cats as sacred creatures, embodiments of the goddess Bastet, Cambyses ordered his soldiers to paint cats on their shields, and allegedly drove herds of live cats, dogs, ibises, and other animals ahead of his army during the assault. The Egyptian soldiers, horrified at the prospect of harming the animals, or invoking divine wrath, hesitated. Many dropped their weapons. Some refused to fight entirely. The result? A stunning Persian victory, with minimal casualties. But this wasn't a one-time trick. Across the ancient world, belief was a battlefield tool. In India, cows were and still are considered sacred. During regional conflicts, some kingdoms would use herds of cattle as literal buffers or tie prisoners to cows, ensuring the enemy wouldn't risk harming them. In some cases, war elephants were adorned with religious markings, not just for spectacle but to imbue the animals with divine protection, making hesitation more likely in opposing ranks. These weren't battle-hardened tactics, they were guilt traps. They preyed on belief, morality, and fear of divine punishment. And sometimes they worked better than steel. But they weren't set without risk. If the enemy didn't share your reverence, the tactic collapsed. Sacred cows might become shields or stakes, depending on who you were fighting. Cambyses' gambit at Pelusium worked because it weaponized his enemy's own values. Had the roles been reversed, the Persians likely wouldn't have flinched. Modern eyes see this as psychological warfare, strange, but clever, but it reveals something deeper in ancient combat. Faith wasn't separate from war, it was fused with it. To protect something holy was to protect the cosmos. To break a taboo could doom not just the soldier but the entire society. And in those moments of hesitation, when a sword paused mid-air out of reverence, wars were won. There's something uniquely self-defeating about winning a city, only to burn its aqueducts, salt its fields, and smash its roads right after. And yet many ancient powers, from Assyria to Rome to the Mongols, did just that. They would conquer a territory, then deliberately destroy the very infrastructure that gave it value. Why? Because war wasn't just about territory, it was about domination. Psychological, cultural, and generational domination. If the people couldn't be tamed, they would be punished. And not just punished, erased. The Assyrians were experts in this. When they raised a rebellious city, they often tore down granaries, poisoned wells, and destroyed irrigation systems. The message was clear: resist and your children will starve. Rome too sometimes engaged in this. After defeating Carthage in the Third Punic War, Roman forces burned the city to the ground, enslaved the survivors, and though exaggerated in popular history, may have salted the earth to make sure nothing grew again. Even if the salting myth is debated, the destruction was real. But it wasn't just enemies. Sometimes rulers destroyed their own city's infrastructure to make a statement. In China's spring and autumn period, some warlords burned bridges and roads after crossing them, a literal no-turning-back maneuver meant to inspire courage through desperation. This tactic occasionally worked, but more often left troops stranded, low on supplies and easy to surround. So why persist with such illogical destruction? Because ancient warfare was often performative. A burned city wasn't just a defeat, it was a warning to the world. A kingdom that salted the fields of its enemies sent a signal: this is what happens when you defy us. It created silence, fear, and a legacy of terror. But the long-term cost was high. Infrastructure took generations to rebuild. Once fertile lands became barren, trade routes vanished, and empires that ruled by destruction eventually ran out of things to destroy. In the end, the scorched earth often scorched the conqueror too. Siege towers were one of the most dramatic innovations of ancient warfare. Imagine a multi-story wooden skyscraper on wheels, bristling with archers and spearmen, slowly being rolled toward a city wall. From the ground it must have looked like a nightmare, a fortress on legs coming to swallow your own. But here's the strange truth. Many of these siege towers never actually made it to the walls. They were too heavy, too tall, or built on unstable terrain. Some were constructed too far from the target and couldn't be moved into position before weather destroyed them. In several documented cases, including by the armies of Alexander the Great, massive siege towers were abandoned mid-campaign or destroyed by the defenders before they even got close. At the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the infamous warlord Demetrius I of Macedon built a siege tower so large, called the Helepolis or Taker of Cities, that it stood over 100 feet tall and required thousands of men just to push it. It was covered in iron plates, had multiple floors for archers and ballistae, and was considered a marvel of engineering. And yet, the defenders of Rhodes flooded the terrain, turning it to mud. The giant tower became stuck and never reached the walls. Eventually, Demetrius withdrew and left the tower behind. In other cases, siege towers were simply too big for the roads, or collapsed under their own weight during transportation. Engineers would overbuild them for intimidation, only to find the wheels sank into sand, the joints couldn't hold, or the terrain was impassable. It became a pattern: spend weeks building something that looked impressive on paper, and then never get to use it. So why do it? Partly it was psychological warfare. The very sight of a siege tower approaching could demoralize a city. It might even trigger surrender, but more often, cities learned to call the bluff, especially if they knew the terrain better than the besiegers. Ironically, the most effective siege tools weren't the towering monoliths, but underground sappers, portable rams, or even political betrayal. But those didn't yet look as glorious. Siege towers became a symbol of ancient overconfidence, huge, slow, and too proud to admit that sometimes you just can't push a mountain into battle. In the thick of a battle, swords clashing, arrows flying, one might assume that the time for words had passed. But in many ancient conflicts, rulers sent out envoys and heralds mid-battle, hoping to pause the carnage, deliver terms, or even request surrender. It was a dangerous, confusing, and often disastrous tactic, and it makes little sense by today's standards. Take the Battle of Marathon 490 BCE. The Persian forces, after days of posturing, allegedly attempted to send final messages to the Athenians, both warnings and offers of submission, even as troops began to clash. The Athenians, already incensed by the invasion, ignored them completely and charged headlong into one of history's most iconic battles. In Roman and Carthaginian warfare, messengers would sometimes be sent with white flags, but there was no universal symbol of truce, and in more chaotic skirmishes, these emissaries were mistaken for enemy spies or cut down accidentally by archers unaware of their status. At the Battle of Cannae, it's believed that messages were still being exchanged even as the Roman legions began to die by the tens of thousands. Some Roman officers refused surrender terms, others tried to negotiate, and Hannibal, already encircling them, used the distraction to tighten the noose. But perhaps the strangest examples come from pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, where certain wars, like the Flowery Wars between Aztec states, were conducted with bizarre rules. Negotiations, ceremonial pauses, and prisoner exchanges occurred during the battle itself. Warriors would shout terms across the field, or send runners back and forth. Some of these were honored, some ended in death. It reveals a different mindset. War was not just about victory but ritual, prestige, and moral theater. Breaking the rhythm with a message wasn't always seen as foolish. Sometimes it was honorable. But honor doesn't always survive chaos. More often than not, the messenger was ignored, or killed, or became a symbol of desperation. Because once swords are drawn, words become hard to hear. The Phalanx was the pride of Greek warfare. Rows upon rows of hoplites, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked together, spears pointing forward like a wall of death. On flat, open ground it was nearly unstoppable, a human tank rolling forward with terrifying unity. But not all ground is flat. And yet again and again ancient armies tried to march phalanxes into forests, hills, narrow valleys and broken terrain, as if the terrain would politely accommodate their geometry. The result? Chaos. In forests, the tight formation of the phalanx becomes a liability, trees break ranks, uneven footing throws off timing. A single stumble can ripple through the formation like a domino line of clashing bronze in collapsing order. Spears can't be angled properly, visibility drops, and the whole tactical advantage, unity, dissolves into a mass of confused soldiers bumping into one another. Historians point to the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, where the Macedonian phalanx faced the Roman legions. The terrain was hilly and disorganized, perfect for breaking formation. As the phalanx moved uphill and began to lose coherence, the Roman soldiers, more flexible and individually trained, tore into the vulnerable gaps. The Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus used this to his advantage. While the Macedonian right wing was advancing in phalanx formation, their left was still scrambling into position. The disjointed nature of the terrain made the phalanx impossible to coordinate. The Romans exploited this, attacking the disorganized side first and routing it. The phalanx looked powerful on paper. In practice it was like trying to carry a pane of glass through a crowded market. Any obstacle shattered the advantage. Still, generals clung to the tactic. Why? Because when it did work, it was beautiful. The sight of a glimmering wall of soldiers moving in unison was enough to terrify enemies. The cultural memory of past victories made commanders reluctant to evolve, and for many it wasn't just a formation, it was identity. The phalanx symbolized the disciplined city-state. To abandon it felt like abandoning the order of the cosmos. But nature doesn't set care about your symmetry. And in the woods discipline turns into confusion, and confusion into death. There's something cinematic about a storm of fire arrows arcing through the night sky, striking roofs, and igniting chaos. And it's true, fire arrows had psychological and tactical uses. But many ancient armies made the mistake of using them against stone fortresses, hoping to burn down what could not burn. You can set stone on fire. And yet, battles from China to Byzantium are filled with reports of commanders wasting volleys of fire arrows against cities made almost entirely of stone or tile. In some cases it was a misunderstanding of materials. In others it was overconfidence, or sheer desperation. The real use of fire arrows was against wooden fortifications, thatched roofs, and supply depots, soft targets where flames could spread. When used correctly they could cause devastating fires, create panic, and weaken the defenders' morale. But when misused, as in the Battle of Shenyang 1267-1273 during the Mongol invasions, fire-based tactics were employed against fire-resistant cities. The Mongols eventually resorted to gunpowder bombs and siege engines, abandoning fire arrows altogether. Even in Europe, during sieges like those at Rocroi or Rhodes, attackers wasted precious fire arrows trying to ignite fortresses designed to withstand bombardment and flame. Meanwhile, defenders had wet hides and sand ready, minimizing the impact even if something flammable did catch. So why persist? Because fire was dramatic, and drama creates fear. Even if the walls didn't burn, the sight of flames was terrifying. Night attacks with fire arrows caused confusion, people panicked, soldiers rushed to protect supply wagons or stables, and in the chaos, real vulnerabilities could be exploited. But as a direct siege tool, against stone, it made no sense. And as centuries passed, the tactic faded. More precise incendiaries, early explosives, and siege cannons replaced the fantasy of setting a castle ablaze with arrows. But the myth of fire's power lingered. Even in tactics, hope burns eternal, even when it shouldn't. It's one thing to march into war with armor and steel. It's another to bring a sacred bull, a venerated eagle, or even a war elephant considered a divine incarnation into the chaos of combat, and assume it will tip the balance. Across ancient civilizations, animals were not just symbols of power, they were believed to channel divine favor, inspire troops, and terrify enemies. But in reality their use on the battlefield often resulted in confusion, panic, and uncontrollable chaos, sometimes turning the tide against the very armies that deployed them. Let's begin with war elephants. In the hands of skilled commanders like those of the Maurya Empire or Carthage's Hannibal, elephants could cause devastating charges, but they were notoriously unpredictable. When frightened, injured, or enraged, these massive creatures often turned on their own troops, trampling soldiers and breaking formations. During the Battle of Zama 202 BCE, the Roman general Scipio Africanus cleverly opened gaps in his lines, letting Hannibal's elephants pass harmlessly through, where they could be neutralized. Worse still, some elephants panicked early and ran back into the Carthaginian ranks, causing chaos before the first sword had swung. Then there were the sacred animals. In Egypt, sacred cats were sometimes depicted on military standards, and soldiers were known to carry animal effigies, sometimes even real animals, as spiritual protection. The Persian king Cambyses II allegedly used this to his advantage at the Battle of Pelusium, placing cats and other animals sacred to Egyptians at the front lines. The Egyptian soldiers, afraid to harm the animals and anger their gods, hesitated and lost the battle. But the strategy was a one-time trick. In most cases, animals, whether sacred or symbolic, were unreliable, easily frightened by loud sounds, smoke, and sudden movements. Horses were trained for battle, but other animals, not so much. The Romans learned this the hard way when using wild boars and dogs in failed attempts to disrupt enemy formations. The animals often refused to charge, ran the wrong direction, or turned feral and uncontrollable. It's easy to see the appeal. A divine beast on the battlefield, carrying the hopes of a people protected by myth. But war does not bow to symbolism. And when the arrows fly, your sacred creature doesn't pray, it runs. In ancient warfare, water was life. You needed it for your soldiers, your horses, your campfires, and your cooking. So naturally, many armies set up camp near rivers or lakes. The mistake? They set up too close. Rivers offered water. Yes, but they also offered floods, ambush routes, mosquito-infested marshlands, and worst of all, an obstacle to retreat. More than one army has perished, not from swords, but from poor hydrological planning. Let's start with the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, 9 CE. Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions into Germanic territory, camping near rivers as they pushed deeper. In the narrow, rain-drenched woods, streams swelled, roads vanished. The muddy terrain turned legions into sitting ducks. When the Germanic tribes attacked, the Romans couldn't retreat or regroup. They were stuck between swamp and ambush. In other cases, flooding itself ended campaigns. In China's Warring States period, some armies built fortified river camps with no higher ground nearby. During storms, rivers rose rapidly, flooding camps, washing away equipment, and drowning soldiers in their sleep. Even without floods, rivers were tactical liabilities. At the Battle of Raphia, 217 BCE, part of the Seleucid army camped near water, only to be outflanked when their enemy crossed the river upstream at night and attacked from behind. The river that had provided comfort became a trap. Still, the logic was seductive: access to clean water, protection on one side, and easier supply movement. But it only worked if commanders understood the terrain, and in many cases they didn't. The ancients had no satellite images, no floodplain maps, no weather forecasts. So they gambled. And when the rains came, or when the enemy waited silently across in the dark, their perfect camp became a coffin. Because nature doesn't care if you stir thirsty. It only cares that you didn't look up. There's something admirable, even beautiful, about honoring a spiritual truce during conflict. But from a tactical perspective, it makes absolutely no sense. In ancient Greece, during the height of the Eleusinian mysteries, a sacred religious festival dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, all hostilities were expected to pause. Wars would literally halt so that citizens could participate in the rituals. Roads had to be safe. Armies were expected to stand down. Enemies for a moment were fellow Greeks bound by divine respect. The Eleusinian mysteries were not some minor local observance. They were a pan-Hellenic event, drawing people from across city-states, including Athens, Sparta, and beyond. The rituals were secret, but believed to guarantee blessings in the afterlife. The cost of interfering, offending the gods. So during wartime, armies either pulled back or promised not to block the sacred pilgrimage route between Athens and Eleusis. You can imagine what happened next. Some generals honored the truce. others didn't. In 415 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, religious tensions were already high after the infamous mutilation of the Hermes statues in Athens. Superstition reigned. Armies hesitated. Meanwhile, factions used the truce as an opportunity to reposition, spy, or fortify, knowing their enemies were restrained. Worse still, spiritual truces were often unspoken assumptions, not formal treaties, that left huge room for exploitation. One side might march forward with olive branches while the other seized high ground. So why not abandon the tradition altogether? Because the wrath of the gods was seen as worse than military loss. Breaking the sacred truce risked plague, famine, and divine punishment, a cost that no general, however pragmatic, wanted on his name. It wasn't just about the soldiers, it was about collective karma. Still, it created a tactical paradox. War interrupted by ritual, logic suspended for myth, and advantage lost in the name of spiritual survival. You can't win a war if you're worried about the afterlife. But you can lose one, trying to keep the gods happy. No, this is not a metaphor. There are well-documented instances in ancient warfare where soldiers or slaves were buried alive beneath siege towers or catapults to bless the machines and protect them in battle. In ancient China, during the Warring States period, certain generals believed that the spirit of a human sacrifice could inhabit a siege machine and bring it luck, or at least keep misfortune away. The idea was that a soul, tethered by violence, would animate the weapon like a guardian spirit. Similarly, in the Middle East and Anatolia, some cultures practiced foundation sacrifices, burying living people under bridges or buildings to ensure their stability. This architectural superstition bled into military thinking. If it worked for temples, maybe it worked for towers. So when a wooden siege tower was built, it was sometimes inaugurated with a human burial beneath the wheels. The belief it would protect the soldiers operating the machine and intimidate defenders on the wall who would know the attackers had already offered blood. Did it work? Of course not. Siege machines still broke, they still burned, they still fell into ditches and got stuck in the mud. But belief is a powerful thing, and fear even more so. In Roman accounts, enemy troops encountering such tactics were often shaken, not because of the military implications, but the psychological ones. An army willing to kill its own men before the first stone is launched. What else might they be willing to do? But the real problem was morale. No one wanted to be the chosen sacrifice. Stories spread, troops grew superstitious, volunteers fled. Even in ancient times, soldiers were human, and humans don't like the idea of being buried alive in the name of physics and ghosts. Eventually the practice faded. Siege technology advanced. Superstition was outpaced by engineering, and the souls of the condemned were forgotten beneath layers of dust, stone, and time. Still, the dirt remembers, and so do we. If you can't win with strength, perhaps you can win with fear. In several ancient conflicts, military leaders turned corpses into messages, transforming the fallen into instruments of psychological warfare. The logic was grotesque, but effective. If your enemies fear what you'll do to their bodies, they may surrender before you touch their souls. One of the most infamous examples comes from Assyrian warfare in the first millennium BCE. The Assyrians were masters of terror. Their inscriptions proudly describe impaling enemy captives, flaying rebels alive, and then displaying their skins on city walls. Heads were piled into pyramids. Corpses were nailed to gates. This wasn't sadism, it was strategy. The Assyrians believed that psychological dominance was more powerful than brute force. If your enemy thought resistance would end with humiliation and death and desecration in the afterlife, he might never fight at all. This same tactic appears in Scythian warfare, where warriors were known to turn enemy scalps into drinking cups, or wear the skin of fallen foes as armor. It was equal parts intimidation and ritual, a way to prove valor, terrify opponents, and assert dominance on the battlefield. But one of the strangest evolutions of corpse-based warfare occurred in medieval China, when decaying bodies were launched via catapult into besieged cities, not just as a form of biological warfare but to demoralize those inside. You thought your general was brave. Now his rotting body is flying through your window. The Mongols perfected this technique, flinging infected corpses over walls to spread disease and despair. These tactics were horrifying, but in many cases they worked. Cities surrendered not out of defeat, but out of sheer horror. The irony. In the end, no corpse cares what happens to it. Only the living do. Submarine warfare didn't begin in the 20th century. It began with men holding their breath and hoping not to die. In the ancient world, several empires attempted underwater sabotage or amphibious surprise attacks, despite having no real technology to support it. The most famous examples come from ancient Greece, Rome, and later Byzantine campaigns. The strategy: send elite swimmers beneath water to cut anchor lines, damage ships, or sneak into harbors under cover of darkness. These divers, often fishermen or trained slaves, relied solely on lung capacity and fearlessness. No oxygen tanks, no goggles, no backup. During the siege of Tyre 332 BCE, Alexander the Great attempted to construct a causeway into the city. In response, Tyrians sent underwater swimmers to sabotage the structure at night, loosening stones and destabilizing the foundation. They moved like ghosts, unseen, silent, and barely alive. In some Roman naval campaigns, divers were trained to attach ropes or flaming pitch to enemy ships from beneath, emerging only after the work was done. Occasionally they carried hollow reeds to breathe through, making them invisible from the surface. This primitive snorkel wasn't always effective, but it offered just enough air to delay drowning. Byzantines used similar methods in harbor defense, hiding divers beneath docks or setting underwater traps for ships. The danger? Almost everything. Hypothermia, drowning, sharks, getting lost in murky waters, being crushed by the weight of soaked armor, and worst of all, surfacing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for what? Often the results were minimal. Divers might sabotage a ship or two, maybe weaken a bridge, but in most cases the cost was disproportionate to the gain. Still, these tactics continued, because sometimes the symbol of an underwater attack was more powerful than the damage itself. It made the enemy paranoid. It turned the water into a threat. And it proved one strange truth even in the ancient world: war wasn't confined to the land. It followed you into the sea. In the chaos of battle, confusion can be as powerful as steel. And in the ancient world, many armies weaponized sound, not through commands or chants, but through deliberately strange, frightening noises meant to disorient, terrify, or demoralize the opposing force before a single blade was drawn. Take the Scythians again, fierce steppe warriors who attached rattling bone charms, hooting flutes, or animal skulls to their clothing and horses. When they rode, they didn't just arrive. They shrieked, howled, and rattled, turning their approach into a sonic storm. Some wore claws or beaks, howling like wolves to confuse troops at night. In India, some ancient armies trained elephants not just for trampling but for terrifying trumpet calls, using loud metal bells, drums, and screaming handlers to simulate a supernatural assault. To opposing infantry who had never seen an elephant, let alone heard one charging in cacophony, it was like being attacked by gods or demons. But perhaps the strangest example of sonic warfare comes from ancient China, where certain Taoist-influenced warlords believed sound could bend reality, or at least morale. Some armies carried massive gongs, or sky drums, intended to summon fear and unbalance enemy spirit. Were these tactics militarily efficient? Not always. The psychological effect was inconsistent. Against seasoned armies, loud noises became just another signal. But against peasants, conscripts, or spiritually superstitious soldiers, a sudden wave of demonic cries could break ranks before contact. And yet, no matter how advanced strategy became, sound, bizarre, bestial, or sacred, remained part of the arsenal. Because war wasn't just physical, it was emotional theater, and in that theater every noise had a role, from the scream of a warrior to the rattle of a ghost. It sounds noble, poetic even. Before some ancient battles, rather than unleashing armies at once, leaders would agree to start with a duel, one warrior from each side, fighting in ritualized single combat to represent their people. The goal? To spare lives, to honor tradition, to seek divine judgment. The most famous version is in Homer's Iliad, when Paris and Menelaus duel over Helen to end the war. It fails, of course, but the idea persisted across real ancient cultures. In early Roman history, the duel between the Horatii and Chariots was a symbolic war between Rome and Alba Longa, three brothers versus three brothers. One survived. A war ended. Or so the story goes. Among the Germanic tribes, similar duels occurred to test the gods' favor. Even in Mesoamerican warfare, especially among the Aztecs, it wasn't uncommon for elite captives to face off ceremonially before larger conflicts, not always to the death, but for display, honor, or sacrifice. So, what went wrong? Everything. First, the duel rarely settled the conflict. If the loser's side refused to honor the outcome, the full war resumed anyway, now with anger and vengeance amplified. Second, outcomes were easily disputed. Was it a fair fight? Was there cheating? Did the gods really choose? And third, it made armies restless. Soldiers trained to fight, now waiting on a single man's success or failure, often found themselves demoralized, impatient, or emotionally unstable if their champion fell. Eventually the practice faded, replaced by mass formations, strategy and less romanticized bloodshed. But echoes of it remain, in sporting rituals, political debates, and even legal trials. The idea that a single brave soul can represent the many, and win a war with honor. Even if in truth it never really worked. When desperation met imagination in the ancient world, logic was often the first casualty, one of the most disturbing and baffling tactics, lighting animals on fire and sending them into battle. Yes, it happened, more than once. The best-known example comes from ancient China, where a siege strategy involved attaching burning material, sometimes oil-soaked cloth or sulfur-soaked reeds, to birds, especially doves or sparrows. These birds, when released, were expected to fly back to their nests, usually located inside the thatched rooftops of the enemy city. The idea was terrifyingly simple. The birds would set the city ablaze from within. Did it work? Rarely. Birds on fire do not fly straight. They panic. They crash. Many of them plummeted back into the camp that launched them, setting their own supplies or tents alight. In some cases, terrified troops fled the burning flock altogether. It was a tactic so wild it backfired more often than not, both literally and metaphorically. This strategy was echoed in the Roman siege of Ambracia, where defenders reportedly tied burning sulfur bundles to birds and launched them toward the Roman camp. Same result: chaos, little gain, and lots of dead birds. But the madness didn't stop at birds. Ancient Indian texts mention elephants set on fire, not in direct attack but in retreat. When a captured elephant couldn't be used, it was sometimes set alight and sent back toward enemy lines, a horrifying, thundering beast ablaze with panic and destruction. Predictably, it didn't discriminate between friend and foe. Flaming pigs were used too, especially against war elephants. The Roman military writer Aelian described how squealing, burning pigs would be released to terrify enemy elephants, who reportedly hated the sound. But again, this tactic rarely had precise outcomes. Fire, panic, and live animals don't coordinate well. So why do it? Desperation, spectacle, psychological shock. Anything to tip the balance in a siege, even if that meant becoming the victim of your own insanity. The battlefield, it seems, has never been short on madness. It's a clever idea. Pretend to run away, lure your enemy into a chase, then ambush them. This tactic, the feigned retreat, was used by many ancient armies, but it was especially favored by nomadic horse archers like the Parthians, Huns, and most famously, the Mongols. Here he sets how it worked. A small unit of cavalry would engage the enemy, fire a few volleys, then appear to flee in terror. The enemy, believing they had gained the upper hand, would pursue them, often breaking formation to do so. Once far enough from their support, the pursuers would be surrounded by hidden cavalry, or hit with an arrow storm from retreating archers who could shoot backward while riding full speed. The Mongols were infamous for this trick. Sounds brilliant, right? It was, until it wasn't. The problem with faking a retreat is that it's hard to distinguish it from an actual retreat. Armies would sometimes really panic. A commander might call for a feigned withdrawal, only to find his troops genuinely start fleeing, spreading chaos through their own ranks. Once morale drops, it's almost impossible to stop it. Even when successful, the fake retreat could backfire. Pursuing enemies might not take the bait, or worse, anticipate the ambush and counter-ambush the ambushers. Some generals walked straight into their own trap. During the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, the Parthians famously used the famed retreat to annihilate a massive Roman force led by Crassus. But later attempts by other commanders to mimic the tactic failed miserably, especially when terrain or discipline wasn't on their side. Ultimately, the fake retreat was a double-edged sword. It required elite control, precise timing, and enormous trust in chaotic conditions. Without those, the tactic turned into a disaster, one where both sides ended up running, and no one remembered who started it. Sometimes, in war, pretending to be weak is more dangerous than just standing your ground. At first glance, it makes perfect sense. Take one of the largest, strongest land animals on Earth, cover it in armor, place warriors or archers on its back, and send it charging into enemy lines. The result should be domination, psychological shock, sheer unstoppable force. But in practice, war elephants were as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy. Used extensively in India, Persia, North Africa, and later Hellenistic armies, war elephants were the ancient version of a tank, a terrifying symbol of imperial might. The Mauryan Empire in India, for example, fielded entire battalions of elephants in formation. When they worked, they could break infantry lines, crush cavalry, and spread terror among enemy ranks unfamiliar with the beasts. However, elephants are not machines. They are intelligent, emotional, and, crucially, highly susceptible to panic. If injured, startled by unfamiliar noises like squealing pigs or fire, or trapped in tight terrain, war elephants could go berserk, turning on their own soldiers and flattening friendly ranks. The very size and power that made them terrifying also made them impossible to control once things went wrong. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, the Carthaginian general Hannibal sent elephants charging the Roman lines, but Scipio Africanus had trained his troops to simply part like waves, letting the elephants charge harmlessly through gaps while attacking from the flanks. Worse, some of Hannibal's elephants turned around and rampaged back into his own troops. In the Hellenistic world, Seleucid kings used elephants to intimidate Roman legions, but once the Romans adapted, with harpoons, fire, or simply tighter formations, elephants often became liabilities, their massive forms collapsing amid chaos, trampling anything in panic. Commanders tried various countermeasures: spiked chains to keep elephants moving forward, handlers with sharp tools to kill the beast if it turned, and heavy armor to keep it focused. But none of it overcame the core problem. You can't reason with a 10-ton animal in terror. In the end, the tactical use of elephants faded. Their cost, risk, and unpredictability outpaced their strategic value, especially once enemies learned how to neutralize them. But for centuries, civilizations still tried, because the spectacle was too grand, the fantasy too seductive. Even if the reality was chaos on four legs, a fortress is supposed to represent safety: stone walls, watchtowers, moats, a last stand against chaos. But across the ancient world, countless fortresses were built without the slightest understanding of actual siege warfare, and when the enemy came, they failed, dramatically. Some were constructed more for ceremonial status than strategic defense: high, elegant towers with no lines of sight, winding walls that provided no choke points, or gates so elaborate and symbolic they became easy targets for rams and fire. Take the Mycenaean citadels of Bronze Age Greece. Impressive? Yes. Strategically sound? Not always. Many were designed with religion or status in mind, leaving blind spots, narrow bottlenecks, or courtyards that made perfect killing grounds for invaders. In early Mesopotamia, some cities like Uruk had walls so vast and sprawling they couldn't be properly defended by the available population. If attackers breached even a small section, the defense collapsed inward like a deflated balloon. Worse, some fortresses were built on flat plains with no water source inside, making them entirely dependent on outer wells. In a siege, the enemy didn't need to attack. They just needed to wait. The fortress would surrender to thirst. Even in medieval fort design, early castles reused Roman layouts, unaware that siege tactics had changed. Battering rams, siege towers, and mining operations made many of these designs obsolete, yet kings kept replicating them, more for aesthetics and legacy than survival. One especially bizarre example: Some smaller Iron Age hill forts in Britain had wooden gates inside the wall perimeter, meaning attackers who breached the gate could literally set fire to the defender's own entryway from within. Ultimately, fortresses that ignored the evolving realities of siege warfare became beautiful traps for their own people. In war, style without strategy is just architecture waiting to collapse. One of the most enduring images of ancient siege warfare is a brave soldier climbing a wooden ladder, shield on his back, sword in hand, reaching desperately toward the top of a fortified wall. Now imagine doing that, without any cover, while defenders pelt you with arrows, stones, boiling pitch or worse, and with your own weight making the ladder sway violently beneath you. It sounds suicidal. That's because most of the time it was. Despite how often ladders appeared in sieges, their tactical logic was deeply flawed unless used under extremely specific conditions. Surprise nearly impossible in prolonged sieges, massive coordination to overwhelm a wall at multiple points, and diversion, so the enemy wasn't waiting to cut down the climbers. Most ancient walls had parapets, murder holes, and defenders stationed above with ample supplies of projectiles. Climbing slowly up a narrow ladder with no ability to dodge was akin to volunteering for target practice. At the siege of Masada in 73 CE, the Roman army wisely avoided ladders altogether and instead built a giant ramp up the side of the mountain, a massive engineering effort, but one that avoided turning their men into falling corpses. In other sieges, ladders were attempted purely out of desperation. During the First Jewish-Roman War, zealot forces tried makeshift ladders against Roman towers, only to be shoved off one by one. Defenders didn't even have to fight. Gravity did the work. Even when a climber reached the top, they were immediately alone, surrounded by enemies, exposed, and often cut down before their comrades could follow. So why use them? Sometimes commanders had no other option. Building siege towers or battering rams took time and resources. Ladders could be cobbled together quickly. In fast-moving campaigns or surprise raids, they were a gamble worth taking. Occasionally, they even worked, if the defenders had already broken or were vastly outnumbered. But as a strategy, it was like trying to storm a fortress by jumping into the teeth of a lion, armed with nothing but hope and a high pain tolerance. Naval combat in the ancient world wasn't fought with cannon or torpedoes. It was fought by ramming, rowing, and often boarding enemy ships like a floating land battle. Sounds simple, until you realize that many ancient soldiers had no idea how to fight at sea. Take the Romans, for example. In their early encounters with the Carthaginian navy, they had barely any naval tradition, so when they wanted to fight sea battles, they didn't train sailors. They trained infantry, then put them on ships and had them treat it like a land engagement. Their solution? A boarding device called the corvus, a spiked bridge that dropped down onto the enemy ship, locking the two vessels together so the Romans could fight as if they were still on dry land. No maneuvering, no ship-to-ship tactics, just brute infantry force. The idea worked once, but the corvus made ships top-heavy, prone to capsizing in storms, and clumsy to maneuver. Multiple fleets were lost at sea due to poor naval understanding. The Greeks were better trained in naval matters with triremes designed for speed and ramming, but even they often relied on boarding during desperate fights. At the Battle of Arginusi in 406 BCE, massive boarding clashes turned the Aegean into a melee, one where drowning was as likely as death by blade. Why did they do it? Partly because ancient ships weren't stable gun platforms. They didn't have ranged weapons capable of decisive damage, and once ramming failed, or was impossible due to tight conditions, the battle became a chaotic mess of shouting, shoving, and slashing on slick, bobbing decks. Many soldiers weren't trained for this. They couldn't swim. They had no concept of sea fighting beyond try not to fall in. If a ship started sinking, panic followed. Organized retreat was rare. Most ships became tombs. Naval boarding in ancient warfare was not strategy. It was improvised chaos dressed in armor. And most of the time the ocean won. Some ancient armies didn't just march with banners or chants. They brought along sacred animals, convinced that divinity or superstition could tip the balance of war. And in more than one case, this belief led to military disaster. Consider the ancient Egyptians who revered cats as sacred beings, embodiments of the goddess Bastet. During the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE, the invading Persian king Cambyses II supposedly exploited this reverence. According to some historical sources, notably Polyaenus, he ordered his troops to paint cats on their shields, and may have even driven real cats and other sacred animals ahead of his front lines. The Egyptians, terrified of harming sacred beings, hesitated to fight. The result? A humiliating defeat, and the fall of Egypt to Persian control. But it wasn't just Egypt. In many cultures, animals were seen as omens or divine instruments. Indian war elephants, as discussed earlier, carried symbolic weight as well as literal armor. Certain birds were considered messengers of the gods in Rome, and disrupting their patterns could delay or even cancel entire campaigns. In some Central Asian cultures, wolves or bears were used as war symbols, sometimes even unleashed as a kind of psychological tactic. But these animals were not trained. They were wild, unpredictable, just as likely to turn on their handlers as their enemies. And while the spiritual symbolism may have stirred courage in troops, the tactical logic made little sense. Relying on animals, sacred or not, introduced an uncontrollable variable into an already chaotic battlefield. Fear of harming the animal often created paralysis, hesitation, or distraction. The tragedy, in honoring the sacred, armies sometimes sacrifice strategy. And the gods, it turns out, don't always take sides in war. The ancient world loved an impressive machine, and nowhere was this obsession clearer than in the realm of siege warfare, where inventors designed bizarre, elaborate contraptions that, while impressive on paper, often failed miserably in practice. Take the legendary engineer Archimedes during the siege of Syracuse circa 214 BCE. Roman forces attacked the city, and Archimedes supposedly constructed all manner of complex defenses: giant claws to lift enemy ships, mirrors to reflect sunlight and burn sails, catapults calibrated with mathematical precision. Some of this may have worked, much of it may be myth, but the idea of intellectual overconfidence in war tech has real historical roots. Hellenistic kingdoms, eager to show off technological superiority, often invested in massive siege towers, some with dozens of floors, rotating mechanisms, or fireproof skins. But many of these towers were too large to move effectively, bogging down in muddy terrain or collapsing under their own weight. One of the most spectacular failures came from Demetrius, I of Macedon, known as the Besieger. In 305 BCE, during his siege of Rhodes, he constructed a monstrous siege tower called the Helepolis, over 100 feet tall, armored in iron, and pushed by thousands of men. It terrified the Rhodians until they simply flooded the ground around the city, turning the tower's advance into a muddy, sinking joke. And the cost? Astronomical. Engineers and kings treated these machines like vanity projects. The more complex the device, the greater the glory, even if they never worked. Some machines required hours to reload, broke after a single use, or became fire hazards when enemies launched flaming arrows. In the cold reality of siege warfare, simplicity usually won: battering rams, tunnels, fire, bribery. But ancient rulers couldn't resist the allure of genius. Even when genius got crushed under its own gears. The Greek phalanx is one of the most iconic military formations in history, a wall of shields and spears, shoulder to shoulder, advancing like a single body. It worked wonders on flat plains, like those of Marathon or Plataea. But the real tactical absurdity came later, when generals tried to use the phalanx in terrain where it simply didn't belong. In theory, the phalanx offered near-perfect defense from the front: long spears, sarissas, interlocking shields, and densely packed troops. But it had two fatal flaws: zero flexibility and no side or rear protection. And yet commanders marched phalanx formations into rocky mountain passes, narrow defiles, swampy fields, or forests where cohesion was impossible. A single stumble or tree root could break the wall, and once broken, the formation crumbled. Individual soldiers exposed, unable to maneuver, vulnerable to flanking. The classic example comes from the Battle of Cynocephalae, 197 BCE, where Roman manipular legions, divided into flexible blocks, outmaneuvered the Macedonian phalanx on hilly terrain. The phalanx was powerful in theory but became a liability on slopes, where alignment broke and movement slowed. The Romans exploited this with devastating efficiency. So why did generals persist? Because the phalanx wasn't just a formation, it was a cultural identity. To abandon it meant discarding centuries of Greek martial pride. Even after its obsolescence became obvious, some Hellenistic commanders clung to it out of tradition or sheer denial. They believed in the myth of invincibility more than the reality of warfare. And that myth got a lot of men killed, standing shoulder to shoulder, unable to turn, unable to flee. In modern warfare, timing is determined by weather, logistics, and enemy movement, but in much of the ancient world, timing was dictated by the stars. Yes, the heavens above influenced not only daily life but the very moment of battle. From Mesopotamia to Rome to China, commanders consulted astrologers and diviners before attacking. If the omens weren't right, campaigns were delayed, even in the face of obvious tactical advantage. Consider the ancient Babylonians, whose astrologers tracked planetary alignments and lunar eclipses as signs of favor or doom. A poorly timed lunar phase could halt a king's army on the eve of victory. In Rome, generals often delayed engagements due to bad auspices, like birds flying in the wrong direction or the failure of sacred chickens to eat. Publius Claudius Pulcher famously ignored such warnings before the Battle of Drepana, 249 BCE, joking, "If they won't eat, let them drink," and tossed the sacred birds overboard. He lost the battle, and most of his fleet. Even Chinese military commanders during the Han Dynasty considered astrological omens and cosmic harmony like the balance of yin and yang before engaging the enemy. Astrology wasn't fringe, it was institutional. And while some of this may have had morale benefits, it often led to tactical paralysis. Golden opportunities were missed, surprise was squandered, momentum evaporated. Commanders delayed for days, even weeks, waiting for the right star to rise, while enemies regrouped, weather changed, or supplies ran out. War is messy, but astrology made it even messier. Because no matter what the heavens said, blood still fell on earth. In times of desperation, kingdoms often raised massive peasant armies, hastily conscripted, poorly equipped, and barely trained. And instead of adjusting tactics to suit this reality, many commanders made the fatal mistake of teaching them elite formations meant for professional soldiers. Imagine a terrified farmer, pulled from his field and handed a rusting spear. He's told to hold the line, maintain spacing, brace for cavalry, and rotate ranks in perfect sync, like a Spartan hoplite or Roman legionary. It rarely worked. The idea was simple: impose order through formation, but real formations require weeks, sometimes months of drilling, discipline under fire, trust in fellow soldiers, and the ability to follow shouted commands through smoke and chaos. Peasant troops had none of this. At the Battle of Agincourt 1415 CE, though later than our ancient examples, French commanders ordered foot soldiers into structured charges that collapsed almost immediately under English longbows in muddy terrain. While not ancient in the strictest sense, it demonstrates the same recurring flaw, giving civilian levies military instructions designed for elite professionals. In older eras, Assyrian and Persian armies sometimes fielded large conscript groups with complex expectations. They'd be placed in structured lines behind elite troops, but when the front cracked, the rear dissolved in chaos. Often their role was more decorative, to pad out numbers or intimidate enemies, than genuinely effective. In China, some dynasties conscripted rural men into rigid box formations against steppe cavalry, expecting them to behave like trained spearmen. In reality, they broke rank the moment arrows flew, leaving gaps for cavalry to exploit. The lesson: training has limits. Real war breaks theory. And when peasants run, the formation goes with them. Communication in ancient warfare was an art form. Without radios, commanders relied on visual signals, horns, drums, banners, and shouted commands to relay orders. It worked, until it didn't. In some cases, these signals were so predictable, so rigid, that enemy commanders could learn and mimic them, or worse, wait for them and use them against their originators. During the Warring States period in China, generals used coded drum beats to signal flanking maneuvers or charges, but as campaigns dragged on, enemies began recognizing the patterns, baiting premature movements, or launching counterattacks timed with fake drums. In other regions, battlefield horns were used to scare enemies, coordinate formations, or signal retreats. But horns were loud, and hearing a retreat call, whether intended or faked, could send entire divisions fleeing. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, Parthian horse archers used drums and trumpet noise to disorient Roman legions. They kept up the din all day, blending real attacks with psychological torment, exhausting the Romans before the real assault came. Meanwhile, colored banners were used in Persian and Egyptian armies to indicate position or intent, but in the dust of combat they could be misread, or lost altogether. In some cases, units held their ground awaiting a banner command that had already been dropped or captured. The fatal flaw was over-reliance. Drums became gospel, horns became panic switches, without them troops froze, and when faked they followed phantom orders. The enemy didn't always need to outfight you. Sometimes, they just needed to outsignal you. It sounds unbelievable, even suicidal, but there are several recorded instances in ancient warfare where armies intentionally poisoned or destroyed their own water sources as a strategy. The logic: deny resources to the enemy. But in practice the results were often catastrophic, not just for the invading forces but for the defenders themselves, their civilians, and even their own soldiers. One infamous example comes from ancient Mesopotamia, where retreating forces occasionally dumped bitter herbs, animal carcasses, or excrement into wells and cisterns before abandoning a settlement. The goal was to render the water undrinkable for the pursuing enemy, but when the enemy took the area faster than expected, or the defending army needed to retake it, they were left with no clean water themselves. In the Peloponnesian War, similar strategies were rumored among the Spartans and Athenians, though usually less dramatic, sabotaging aqueducts or clogging cisterns. In some cases, civilians were the ones to suffer most, especially when cities under siege preemptively poisoned nearby rivers, not realizing those same rivers fed their own underground reservoirs. Perhaps the most baffling episode occurred in ancient China, where some local warlords would salt fields and dump toxins in rivers to prevent rival factions from foraging. When those factions bypassed the area or used portable water supplies, the attacking side was left with a ravaged landscape and bitterly thirsty troops. Worse still, these scorched earth tactics often led to long-term consequences. Farmers couldn't grow crops. Livestock died. Villages were permanently abandoned. To win a war, they tried to starve and dehydrate their enemies. But often they just poisoned their own future. Many ancient battles took place in open plains, forests, or hills. But occasionally armies were drawn into urban environments, narrow streets, stone alleys, and walled cities. And yet, even when commanders knew the dangers, some chose to fight in tight quarters without a viable exit, leading to massive casualties and tactical embarrassment. The Romans, for all their battlefield brilliance, made this mistake during the Battle of the Eleusinian 390 BCE, where troops funneled into a narrow river crossing were routed by the Gauls and couldn't escape the bottleneck. But the real disaster came centuries later, in urban battles across Judea, Gaul, and Germania, where troops chased rebels or defenders into cities, only to find themselves trapped with no maneuvering room and unfamiliar with the terrain. In Greece, hoplite armies were almost useless in towns. Their phalanxes couldn't operate in alleys, and yet they still tried to advance in blocks, only to be picked off by archers on rooftops or stabbed from windows. The Parthians and Seleucids, when clashing in desert towns, often deployed cavalry too close to walls, their horses slipping on stone, their archers cornered. In some cases, retreat was impossible without leaving half their forces behind. And let's not forget the siege of Jerusalem 70 CE, where urban warfare turned into house-to-house slaughter. Roman troops advanced too quickly, through breach points, and became disoriented in winding corridors, leading to friendly fire, lost units, and an eventual reliance on fire to flush out resistance, which destroyed parts of the city they wanted to preserve. Urban fighting wasn't just dangerous, it was logistically insane in an era with no radios, poor maps, and no drones to scout ahead. They walked into stone traps with nowhere to go but forward. And often forward meant death in a dead end. Fire was a weapon, but it was never just a weapon. In ancient warfare, fire was a message of power, terror, and divine wrath. And yet, more often than not, it became a message misunderstood by its sender. Because the commanders who unleashed fire on their enemies frequently forgot they were standing on the same stage. It begins with good intentions, as many disasters do: a dry field, a wall of flaming pitch, a ring of fire designed to trap the enemy. But the problem with fire isn't the idea. It's that fire has no loyalty. It burns with the wind, not the cause. And in ancient battles, where terrain was unpredictable and wind patterns misunderstood, this turned many ambitious strategies into tragic infernos. One of the most infamous examples comes from the siege warfare tactics of the Near East. Cities often coated their outer walls and trenches with oil or resin, preparing to ignite them when the enemy advanced. The defenders at the city of Sardis, in the early 5th century BCE, did exactly that, attempting to create a wall of fire to block Persian attackers. But as the flames spread and the wind shifted, the blaze turned inward. Wooden gates caught, homes near the walls burned, and the defenders were forced to retreat into the heart of the city, now choking on their own smoke. In India, fire tactics were deeply tied to elephant warfare. War elephants were sometimes trained to run into enemy lines with burning torches strapped to their sides or incendiary devices on their tusks. The hope was panic, chaos in the enemy's front ranks. But elephants, being animals, panicked more reliably than predicted. In multiple battles across the Maurya and later Gupta periods, elephants turned around, screaming, setting fire to supply carts, cavalry and even command tents behind them. Entire formations collapsed before the enemy drew near. Then there were scorched earth strategies, a defensive use of fire meant to deprive the enemy of resources. Alexander the Great witnessed this firsthand during his campaigns in Persia. Villages and fields were burned ahead of his march, denying food and shelter, but the Persians often misjudged their own withdrawal speed or the proximity of their troops. In some cases, Persian rear guards found themselves trapped in their own fire lines. No battle needed to be fought, the fire had done the killing. The most devastating misuse of fire may belong to the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Jewish defenders had built layered walls, inner sanctuaries and defense towers. But once fire entered the picture, whether sparked by Roman siege engines or desperate defenders, control vanished. Temple records claim the flames grew beyond expectation, leaping across stone and mortar as though possessed. Entire quarters of the city became unpassable. Roman soldiers pressed forward through fire, many collapsing in heat before swords were ever drawn. Fire magnifies intent, but it also ignores orders. Once unleashed, it cannot be recalled. And in ancient battles with flammable siege towers, wooden barricades, tents packed with supplies, it often consumed the attacker, the defender, and the truth in between. The tactic was simple: burn the enemy out. But the outcome was usually this: everyone burned. Take the high ground. It's one of the oldest rules in warfare. Higher ground means greater visibility, gravity-assisted charges and defensive strength. But like all rules in ancient war, it was often misunderstood, misapplied or mythologized beyond reason. Because what ancient commanders failed to grasp or chose to ignore was that the high ground is only as good as what you can do from it. Enter the tactical disaster of securing elevated terrain, with no way to hold it, supply it or retreat from it. Let's start with the most basic oversight. Steep elevation often restricts movement. In the Battle of Gergovia 52 BCE, Julius Caesar, normally a master of strategic manipulation, attempted to take a Gallic hilltop stronghold. His forces climbed the slopes under enemy fire, arriving winded and disorganized. Once at the top, the terrain was too narrow to form proper Roman battle lines. The Gauls countercharged, pushing the Romans down the hill. It was one of Caesar's few major defeats, and it was caused not by Gallic brilliance, but by his own faith in taking the high ground. In the Indian subcontinent, fortified hill forts were considered virtually unassailable. Commanders sought to replicate this advantage by rushing to occupy surrounding ridges, but many hilltop victories turned into logistical nightmares. Water, food, and communication had to be hauled up winding mountain paths, sometimes guarded by enemy archers. The attackers, now stranded above the battlefield, found themselves dehydrated, exhausted, and blind to enemy movements beyond the slopes. Some tactics became absurd. During the Warring States period in China, a general once ordered his troops to ascend a high ridge before battle, not to gain advantage but to perform a ritual meant to scare the enemy with celestial alignment. The soldiers climbed all night, set off ceremonial fires and waited, only to realize they couldn't descend in time for the battle. The enemy, amused and unbothered, marched around the ridge and attacked the supply lines directly. Then there's the psychological trap of symbolic high ground. Commanders believed that occupying a peak meant divine favor, a literal elevation of purpose, but belief is not ballast. And when the enemy surrounds your base, cuts your food and waits, belief won't keep your forces from starving. A particularly ironic case occurred during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century CE. Jewish rebels fortified mountain caves and plateaus across Judea. The Romans, rather than storming the heights, simply surrounded them and waited. Weeks passed. Water ran out. Eventually, starvation forced surrender. Elevation offers control, but it demands movement, communication, and access. Without those, you stir not above your enemy. You're isolated, alone, watching the battle pass you by. Or worse, watching your doom approach from below, and having nowhere to go but down. Signal fires, ancient humanity's long-distance messaging system. From mountaintop beacons to shoreline smoke plumes, signal fires were the precursor to telegraphs, walkie-talkies, and modern war radios. In theory, they allowed empires to transmit alerts, troop movements, or warnings over vast distances in mere hours. In practice, they caused more confusion than clarity, and in several cases directly contributed to the loss of battles, territory, and trust. Let's start with the infamous signal chain of ancient Persia. The Achaemenid Empire constructed fire towers across key mountain ranges, spaced just far enough for one to see the next when lit. If an invasion was spotted, say Greek hoplites landing on the western shore, a tower would light a flame, which would be seen by the next tower, and so on. The message, trouble is coming. But what the Persians hadn't perfected was coded messaging. A fire could mean danger, but not which kind. Was it a coastal landing, an internal revolt, a fire from robbers, or a false alarm? In 499 BCE, during the Ionian Revolt, one such signal chain lit up unexpectedly in western Anatolia. A garrison city, fearing a Greek raid, lit its tower prematurely. The fires spread all the way to the central command, who panicked and rerouted troops away from the actual front line. By the time they realized it was a false alarm, the real rebels had attacked a different post, which had assumed it was not under threat because the fire hadn't come from their direction. The Chinese faced similar issues. During the Western Zhou dynasty, rulers built elaborate beacon towers along the northern frontier, but a now legendary story involves King Yu of Zhou, who, to impress his consort, lit the beacon towers as a joke. The warlords rushed to defend him, only to find the court laughing at the prank. Embarrassed and furious, they ignored the signals the next time they were lit, which happened to be when the Quanrong tribes really attacked. The king was killed. The dynasty fell, and it all began with a beacon fire used for court entertainment. Even when taken seriously, signal fires were weather-dependent. A foggy day could break the chain. Wind could disperse smoke. A tower keeper's hesitation, or misjudgment of timing, could delay the message by hours. There was also the problem of enemy manipulation. In several conflicts between Rome and Parthia, it's suspected that spies lit false fires to redirect Roman reinforcements. The Romans, relying on simple fire, no fire communication, often didn't realize they were being deceived until too late. In the end, the idea was powerful: distant coordination, fast alerts, centralized command. But it depended entirely on blind trust and visual clarity. And in war, clarity, like smoke, often drifts. Desperation breeds strange alliances, and in ancient warfare, the line between soldier and sword for hire was often blurred beyond recognition. Empires fell back on mercenary forces not out of preference but necessity, when native populations were depleted, overtaxed, or simply too far from the front. But hiring foreign troops who don't speak the language, don't know the terrain, and worst of all, don't understand the politics of the conflict, that's a recipe not just for confusion, but for betrayal. Take Carthage, for example. Their reliance on mercenaries is legendary. Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, Balearic slingers, a patchwork of peoples thrown into formation. During the First Punic War, some of these troops couldn't communicate basic commands from their officers. Others mistakenly attacked Carthaginian allies, not recognizing insignias or uniforms. Hannibal may have been a genius tactician, but even he had to rely on elaborate rehearsals and translators to coordinate attacks across his fragmented army. Things turned worse after the war. Carthage, broke and humiliated, tried to delay payment to its surviving mercenaries. The result, the Mercenary War 241-237 BCE, where thousands of unpaid soldiers turned on their employer, nearly destroying Carthage entirely. The lesson: if you pay men to kill for you, make sure you're not the nearest target when the paycheck disappears. The Greeks fared no better. During the Peloponnesian War, both Sparta and Athens employed mercenaries who changed sides depending on who offered more. Some mercenaries fought for both sides over the course of a single campaign. In fact, some Athenian generals were killed by former hirelings they had once led, and who now fought for Sparta for a slightly larger cut. Even more absurd, in the wars of the Diadochi after Alexander the Great's death, his former generals hired troops from rival territories without disclosing who they'd be fighting. There are letters describing entire companies learning mid-March that they were heading into battle against former countrymen or kin. Some deserted, others hesitated on the field, and some, tragically, only found out after the first clash and realized they'd been tricked into a civil war by a paycheck. The underlying issue wasn't just language or loyalty, it was disconnection. Mercenaries by nature didn't care about the cause, only the contract, and when that contract was vague, the outcome could be fatal. Imagine showing up to a battlefield, armed and armored, only to realize you don't know who the enemy is, or worse, that they used to be you. When we imagine ancient battles, we often think of clashing swords, flying arrows, and war cries, but before all of that, came the entrance. In many cultures, armies marched into battle not in stealth or silence, but in full spectacle: bright uniforms, glinting weapons, painted shields, marching drums, flutes, trumpets, and singing soldiers. The intention was psychological: show the enemy your strength, boost morale, make war into theater. But in reality, this tactic often backfired, making armies easier to see, easier to target, and harder to coordinate once the noise drowned out commands. Let's start with the Romans. Famed for their discipline, legionaries often approached battle in formation, with banners flying and war horns blaring. But when fighting in forests, like in the Teutoburg forest ambush of 9 CE, this practice proved disastrous. The loud procession made them impossible to miss. Germanic tribes waited in silence and launched a surprise attack from the trees. The Romans were butchered. Their visibility and bravado cost them an entire army. In ancient India, war elephants were often adorned with bright fabrics, jingling bells, and howdahs painted in gold and scarlet. A glorious sight, until archers realized these lumbering beasts were perfect, slow-moving targets. Enemies learned to shoot at the eyes of elephants, or simply drive them into panic, turning them against their own troops. One brilliant idea, turning beasts into mobile platforms, was often undone by its own flashiness. Even Greek hoplites, celebrated for their prowess, painted elaborate designs on their shields: gorgons, lions, scorpions. These made them look fearsome, but also made it easy to identify key units or elite troops which clever opponents targeted first. And sound. It wasn't just a morale booster. In some cases it actively confused troops. During the Battle of Plataea, multiple Greek city-states fought side by side, each with their own musicians. Trumpet blasts overlapped. Orders were misheard. A simple signal to flank was misinterpreted as a retreat. The coordination nightmare nearly cost them the fight. Loud music also made it hard to hear enemy movements. Ambushers thrived when armies marched to their own deafening beat. There's a reason modern militaries train in silence, camouflage, and stealth. Because while spectacle might win hearts, it rarely wins wars. And now we reach one of the most baffling tactics of all: dying for dirt. Throughout ancient warfare we find commanders, kings, emperors, generals, ordering their soldiers to hold or take hills, cliffs, plateaus, or outposts that had no lasting value. Why? Pride, ritual, symbolism, or simply momentum. The tragedy: thousands of lives were wasted on terrain that wasn't strategic, wasn't defendable, and wasn't even needed. Take the Battle of Thermopylae, often romanticized, rightfully so, but consider this: the pass could not be held indefinitely. The Greeks knew the Persians would eventually flank them. They held the ground anyway, partly to delay, but also to make a point. The result was heroic, yes, but strategically futile. The Persians passed as predicted. In Rome's campaign in Britain, Caesar ordered his legions to seize hill forts deep in enemy territory, despite lacking the supply lines to hold them. Several times, the Romans took a stronghold only to abandon it days later, losing men for symbolic victories they couldn't maintain. In early Chinese warfare, rival kingdoms like Qin and Chu often clashed over sacred hills or tomb mounds, not because of strategy, but because of ancestral beliefs. A hill was considered lucky, or cursed, or tied to a celestial omen. Armies bled for these sites, and then left them undefended once the prophecy was fulfilled. Perhaps the most tragic example comes from the siege of Masada. The Roman army spent months building an enormous ramp up to a cliff fortress where Jewish rebels had fortified themselves. When they finally breached it, they found nearly everyone inside dead by suicide. The Romans had conquered a hill, but gained nothing. No survivors, no treasure, no tactical reward, just a haunting silence. In each case, the fighting wasn't for supply routes or defensive advantage. It was for pride, for ideology, or to prove they could. And when the smoke cleared, the hill was just a hill again. The bodies were still there, but the meaning had vanished.